He never imagined he'd one day watch bulldozers roll in, ready to churn up his perfectly legal garden under the HOA's command. But that pain paled in comparison to seeing his vibrant green tomatoes, on the verge of harvest, dissolve under a vicious toxic spray unleashed by the HOA and her lackeys. And what other shocking plots does the HOA have in store for him? No one can tell, not even a seasoned ex-lawyer like him. So according to you, what should he do to fight back against the HOA? In just a few minutes, you will witness Miles' plans for retaliation with the HOA. Miles Phillips still remembered the day everything changed. The morning sun warmed his back as he knelt on the soft soil along his driveway, tending to his thriving tomato plants, the last of their kind after 25 years of grueling 90-hour weeks at his law firm. Finally, he'd found peace in gardening, the feel of dirt between his fingers, and the promise of ripe, juicy tomatoes keeping him grounded. Sorry, what do you think you're doing? Miles looked up to see Karen Williams, standing at the edge of his garden, her arms crossed tightly over a designer black blazer. Her meticulously styled honey-brown hair didn't budge in the breeze, and her lips pursed into a thin, disapproving curve. "Good morning, Karen," he said, wiping his hands on his gardening apron. "Just expanded my veggie patch a bit." Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the neatly planted rows. "Those stakes lining your driveway. This is completely unacceptable, Miles. Front yards in Willow Creek estates must be landscaped with approved plants only. Vegetable gardens belong in the back, out of sight." He took a deep breath. Karen had been the head of their homeowners association for the past 4 years, and in that time, their once friendly neighborhood had turned into a battleground of petty rules and fines that doubled every year. "Karen, my property deed predates the HOA by 30 years, Miles said, standing up, suddenly aware of how his dirt-stained jeans clashed with her pristine appearance. "I'm exempt from most of these rules." She snapped at him, pulling out her phone. "I'm documenting this violation. The board will be notified immediately." Miles watched as she snapped several photos, her fingers flying across the screen. A neighbor walking his dog slowed down to gawk at the confrontation. "I've read every page of the HOA agreement," Miles said calmly. "I've kept all the correspondence with the previous board acknowledging my exemption. Want to see the paperwork?" She waved him off dismissively. "Save it for the hearing. You'll get an official violation notice tomorrow. I suggest you remove all this." She gestured vaguely at the garden's supposed mess, "before the fines start piling up." As she strutted away, Miles noticed Mr. Jenkins across the street, watching with a sympathetic look. He'd had his own run-in with Karen last month over the color of his new mailbox, apparently. Forest green wasn't the same as the approved hunter green. That evening, true to her word, Miles found a bright orange violation notice taped to his front door, a $99 daily fine until the unapproved agricultural activity was removed from his front yard. A hearing was scheduled for next week. He brought the notice inside, adding it to his growing file labeled HOA nonsense. But something about this felt different, more targeted, more personal. His phone rang. It was Eleanor Ramos, the sweet elderly woman who'd lived down the street since before the development even had a name. "Miles, dear," her raspy voice came through. "I saw Karen harassing you this morning. You're not the first, you know. Last month, she fined the Thompsons board $700 because their daughter's wheelchair ramp didn't match the neighborhood's architectural aesthetic." His blood boiled. "That can't be legal." "It's not," Eleanor confirmed. "But the Thompsons couldn't afford to fight it. They paid the fine and repainted the ramp. Karen's gotten bolder ever since her friend Waylon became the lawyer for the real estate company." Miles thanked her for the info and hung up. That night, he couldn't sleep. The next morning, Miles decided to dig deeper before heading to work. His family had owned most of this land before selling it to developers in the 1960s. He vaguely recalled his father mentioning retaining certain rights, though he'd never paid much attention. He was rummaging through old boxes in his attic when he heard engines roaring outside. Heavy trucks rumbled up to his front window. He froze, stunned to see 3 massive bulldozers parked across his driveway, completely blocking his car. Karen stood beside them in a crisp pantsuit, flanked by a tall man in an expensive suit. He hadn't noticed a small crowd of neighbors gathering on the sidewalk, wide-eyed and watching. His heart pounded as he grabbed his phone and HOA file. Whatever game Karen was playing, she'd just made a serious mistake. Stepping onto his porch, he saw Karen's face light up with a triumphant smile that sent a chill down his spine. The bulldozer operator sat waiting, engines idling. "Miles Phillips," Karen called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The board held an emergency meeting last night. Your violations are so severe that immediate action is required." The man beside her stepped forward. "I'm Waylon Gutierrez, legal counsel for Willow Creek Estates HOA," he said, gesturing toward Miles's garden beds. "These unauthorized structures are being removed under Section 3.3 of the bylaws, immediate remediation for public nuisance." The neighbors stood in stunned silence. Mrs. Patel covered her mouth in shock. The Henderson kids stopped their bikes to stare. Miles walked calmly down his front steps, his mind racing through options. He needed to stall while figuring out his next move. "Mr. Gutierrez," he said, keeping his voice steady, "you might want to double-check your legal standing here. These aren't structures. They're temporary garden beds. More importantly, you're about to make a very, very costly mistake." Waylon's smile faltered slightly. "Your threats don't concern us, Mr. Phillips. We have full authority under the HOA covenant." Karen stepped forward, practically glowing with power. "Miles, this stubbornness is unnecessary. Just agree to remove these eyesores, pay the accumulated fines, now up to $600, and we can move on." The bulldozer's engines revved louder. The nearest operator looked uneasy, glancing between Miles and Karen. Miles pulled out his phone. "Before you proceed, you should know I'm recording this. I've also just texted my associate at the firm to join us. Oh, and maybe you should know something else about this property." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. "Spare us the legal mess, Miles. Nothing you say can stop this." Just then, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Neighbors parted as Sheriff Martinez stepped out, followed by a woman holding what looked like official county records. Karen's confident mask slipped into confusion, then worry. "What's going on? We don't need law enforcement for a simple HOA matter." Before we continue the story, where in the world are you hearing this story? And have you ever fought against HOA? If you want to know what happens next, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so YouTube can notify you every time we post another story with someone else fighting against HOA. Miles smiled for the first time that morning. "Karen, I don't think you realize whose driveway you've blocked, or whose land your bulldozers are sitting on." At that moment, the county clerk, Ms. Abernathy, struggled with the weight of oversized property maps as she spread them across the sheriff's hood. Neighbors edged closer, whispering to each other. The bulldozer operators shut off their engines, sensing a shift in the air. "These are the original survey maps from 1963, Ms. Abernathy explained, pointing to the yellow documents. "And this is the sale agreement between the Phillips family and Willow Creek Development Corporation." Karen thrust her confidence forward, though it wavered. "This is ridiculous. No ancient paperwork she dug up can override our HOA authority." Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I suggest you listen closely to what Ms. Abernathy is about to explain." The clerk adjusted her glasses. "According to these records, when the Phillips family sold this land for development, they retained specific rights. First, mineral rights beneath the entire 300-acre development. Her finger traced a boundary encompassing their whole neighborhood. Second, all utility usage rights under the main roads. And third, most importantly, explicit exemptions from any future homeowners association for 8 properties they kept for family members." Miles stepped forward. "My house is one of those 8. Waylon Gutierrez frantically flipped through papers in his briefcase. "That's impossible. The HOA covenant applies to all properties in the development, no exemptions mentioned." Ms. Abernathy smiled patiently. "That's because your HOA was established in 1985, Mr. Gutierrez. These agreements were filed with the county in 1963. Your covenant can't supersede prior legal arrangements." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is some kind of trick. Even if Miles's house has special status, he still can't violate basic community standards. Sheriff Martinez cut in. Under county law, he can do whatever he wants with his property as long as it doesn't break zoning regulations. Vegetable gardens are perfectly legal in residential areas. The crowd grew larger. Miles noticed Mr. Jenkins filming on his phone, while Mrs. Patel whispered a translation to her elderly father. Karen turned to the bulldozer operators. This changes nothing. Proceed with the removal as planned. The lead operator shook his head. Sorry, ma'am. I'm not risking my license on disputed property without a court order. I'll get an order today. Karen snapped. Miles stepped closer to her and Waylon, lowering his voice. There's something else you should know. Those bulldozers are parked on a driveway that, per these documents, belongs to me. That's trespassing on private property. And since you brought them here with the clear intent to damage my land, I'll let that implication hang. Waylon grabbed Karen's arm, whispering urgently in her ear. Her eyes widened with something that looked like fear. Sheriff, Miles said calmly, I'd like to file a report for attempted property destruction. Martinez nodded. We can handle that right now. This is outrageous. Karen exploded. The HOA has run this neighborhood for decades. You can't just claim privileges out of nowhere. It's not out of nowhere, a frail voice called from the crowd. Eleanor Ramos shuffled forward, leaning heavily on her cane. Some of us knew about the Phillips exemptions. The old board respected them. But when you took over, Karen glared at Eleanor. Stay out of this. Your Christmas decoration violation hearing is next week. Don't think I've forgotten. Neighbors gasped at the HOA's public threat against the beloved 82-year-old widow. Eleanor smiled sweetly. Oh, I haven't forgotten, dear. In fact, my memory's pretty sharp. I recall when your husband built that 2-ton shed on the Johnsons' property line, and how Waylon here dismissed the violation. What was it again? Administrative discretion. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Karen's face flushed deeper as she scanned the growing number of hostile faces. Waylon checked his watch nervously. Karen, we should continue this privately. Maybe schedule a proper hearing. There'll be no hearing. Miles interrupted. My property's exempt from your authority. Those bulldozers need to leave my driveway now, or I'll add more charges to my complaint. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward. Let's keep this civil, folks. Ms. Williams, Mr. Gutierrez, I suggest you direct these operators to move their equipment. Mr. Phillips, if you want to file that report, we can do it once the area's clear. Karen looked around desperately, realizing she was losing control of the situation and her audience. Neighbors who once feared her now watched with open curiosity and satisfaction. This isn't over, she hissed at Miles, far from a long shot as the bulldozers began backing out of his driveway. Eleanor tapped his arm lightly. Miles, dear, there's something important you should know about the HOA's financial records. What about them? He asked quietly. She glanced around cautiously. Not here too many years. Come to my house tonight. Bring those old deeds. I think we've only scratched the surface of what Karen's been up to. As Karen and Waylon retreated to their waiting car, Miles caught something he'd never seen before, genuine fear in their eyes. Whatever they tried to hide by hastily tearing up his garden, they now realized they might have awakened something far more dangerous than a simple property dispute. The last bulldozer rumbled away, leaving his tomatoes intact. Sheriff Martinez approached with his citation book. Want to file that report now? Miles saw Karen's car speed off and turned to the sheriff. You might want to call the county prosecutor. I've got a feeling this'll involve more than just trespassing before we're done. Eleanor squeezed his hand. Wait until the weekend, she whispered. And Miles, bring a calculator. You'll need it when you see what I found. Neighbors began to disperse, many pausing to eye his garden beds with newfound interest. Whatever Karen had intended, she'd unwittingly sparked resistance. He'd only wanted to grow tomatoes in peace. Now he was about to uncover something that could change their entire community forever. But Miles knew Karen wouldn't stop, and he had no idea what foolish move she'd try next. That night, as the faint moonlight was shrouded by thick clouds, Miles lay in bed, his mind still tangled with the day's events. The roar of the bulldozers had faded, But he knew Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. He drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware that, at that very moment, another plot was unfolding beneath the quiet darkness of Willow Creek Estates. A few streets away, Karen Williams stood in her garage, her sharp eyes glinting with cold fury. Around her were 3 loyal women, the last remnants of the HOA board she'd recruited over her 4-year reign. They wore black hoodies pulled tight to conceal their faces, hands gripping chemical spray bottles and small buckets filled with a solution Karen had prepared earlier. "Miles thinks he can humiliate me in front of the whole neighborhood," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "He wants to play the law game. I'll show him the cost of crossing me." The women nodded silently, offering no words, only following her as they slipped out of the garage and melted into the shadows. They moved swiftly through the narrow streets, dodging streetlights and prying eyes. When they reached the edge of Miles's property, Karen raised a hand to halt them. She stared at the neatly planted tomato beds in his front yard, his pride, a symbol of the freedom he'd wrested from her grip. "Destroy it all," she ordered, her voice icy. The women sprang into action, pouring the chemical concoction over each tomato plant, spraying it hard onto leaves and roots. The hiss of corrosive liquid filled the air, mingling with a pungent, acrid stench. In mere minutes, the once lush garden withered, leaves turning a dull brown, as if scorched by a concentrated acid rain. Karen watched, the corner of her mouth curling into a satisfied smirk. "Done. Let's go," she whispered, leading the group away from the scene before anyone could catch them. The next morning, Miles woke early as usual. Dawn's first light filtered through his window, bringing the sense of peace he'd come to cherish in his gardening days. He threw on an old jacket, grabbed his watering can, and stepped outside to tend to his tomatoes. But as he reached the front yard, he froze, eyes widening in horror. His tomato plants, his small joy after years of backbreaking work, lay crumpled and wilted, as if doused in boiling water at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. The leaves curled grotesquely, stems drooped lifelessly, and the soil reeked of a sharp chemical burn. He knelt, touching a plant, feeling its fragility crumble between his fingers. Then he heard it, a soft, malicious chuckle from across the street. He didn't need to look to know who it was, but he did anyway. There stood Karen, leaning against her sleek car, her triumphant eyes gleaming, and that familiar smug grin plastered across her face. She said nothing, just stared at him with a taunting challenge before sliding into her car and driving off. Miles clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms, but he took a deep breath to rein in his anger. "No," he told himself. "I won't let her win like this." He turned back inside, heading straight for the security camera system he'd installed months ago, a wise choice he now thanked himself for. Sitting at the screen, he rewound the footage from the night before. Under the dim glow of a street lamp, hooded figures in black emerged in his front yard. They moved with eerie precision, dousing his garden with chemicals. Their faces were hidden, but one figure caught his eye, the confident stride, the slight tilt to one side, the petite yet rigid shoulders. "Karen," he muttered, almost certain it was her. The others were likely her cronies, perhaps board members she'd manipulated over the years. Without hesitation, Miles grabbed his keys and drove straight to Karen's house. When he knocked, she opened the door with an unervingly calm demeanor. "Miles," she purred, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "what brings you here so early?" He locked eyes with her, struggling to stay composed. "Someone vandalized my garden last night. I've got camera footage, and I think you know exactly who's behind it." Karen laughed, crossing her arms. "Oh, really? If you're so sure it's me, go ahead and sue. But I'd advise you to have solid proof, Miles. Maybe whoever did it was smart enough to cover their tracks." Her defiance made him want to smash something, but he just nodded coolly. "You'll see," he said, turning to leave. On the drive home, Miles knew he couldn't let this slide as easily as she'd hoped. The camera alone wasn't enough to pin it on Karen directly. She was too cunning to show her face. But he wasn't about to stop there. He called Eleanor Ramos the moment he got back. "Eleanor, I need to see you now. Something big happened." Her raspy voice came through, laced with concern. All right, Miles. Bring whatever you've got. I think it's time we dig deeper into this. When Miles arrived at Eleanor's, she was waiting with a stack of papers on her kitchen table. Sit, she said, sliding a cup of coffee his way. After yesterday, I went through my memories and dug up some things. These are the HOA's financial reports from the past 4 years, stuff Karen and Waylon never wanted anyone to see. Miles scanned the numbers and instantly spotted the red flags. Tens of thousands of dollars from fines had vanished into vague expenses. Legal consulting for Waylon Gutierrez, community maintenance with no receipts, even a reserve fund no one in the neighborhood had ever heard of. They're stealing from us, Miles said, his voice trembling with outrage. Eleanor nodded. I've suspected it for a while, but I had no proof. Now you've got a reason to dig deeper. What about your garden? Miles recounted the morning's events, and Eleanor gripped her cane tighter. I'm sorry about your tomatoes, but this is evidence. Karen's desperate. She knows you're a threat. Miles gave a faint smile. Then I won't stop. I'll find a way to prove she's behind the vandalism, and I'll use these documents to bring her down. After saying goodbye to Eleanor and heading home, Miles sat in his study, the computer screen's glow illuminating his face. He emailed the camera footage to an old friend at his law firm, an image analysis expert. If there's a way to ID this figure, I need to know, he wrote. Then he drafted a letter to all his neighbors, calling for an emergency meeting to discuss the HOA's behavior. He knew Karen wouldn't expect him to rally the entire community against her. As the clock struck midnight, Miles gazed out his window at the once vibrant garden, now a ruined heap. But instead of despair, a fire ignited within him. Karen might have destroyed his tomatoes, but she didn't realize she'd just sparked a war she couldn't win. Just you wait, Karen, he whispered. The game's only begun. The next evening, Eleanor Ramos's small house glowed with light, a stark contrast to its usual quiet calm. Chairs were packed tightly in the living room, some neighbors forced to lean against the walls for lack of space. The air buzzed with tension and excitement, a surge of emotion Willow Creek Estates hadn't felt in years. Miles stood beside Eleanor, clutching the stack of documents she'd given him, his steady gaze sweeping over the crowd. More than 30 neighbors had shown up, from Mr. Jenkins, with his controversial green mailbox, Mrs. Patel with her worried eyes, to the Thompsons, who'd once shelled out $700 for their daughter's wheelchair ramp. Eleanor tapped her cane lightly on the wooden floor to draw attention. Thank you all for coming, she said, her raspy voice carrying a quiet authority. We're here tonight for one reason. Our homeowners association, under Karen Williams's leadership, has gone too far. Miles will explain more, but I want you all to know we don't have to live in fear anymore. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others exchanging skeptical glances. Miles stepped forward, raising the papers high and motioning for silence. I've been targeted by Karen and the HOA over my tomato garden, he began, his voice low but clear. But last night, they crossed a line. Someone, I believe Karen and her cronies, vandalized my garden with chemicals. I've got camera footage, though it's not enough to pin them yet. But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. He paused, scanning the room before continuing. Who here has been fined for absurd reasons? Who's felt bullied by Karen and her board? A trembling hand rose. It was Mr. Jenkins, the elderly man from across the street. Last month, I got hit with a $250 fine for painting my mailbox forest green. Karen said it didn't match the approved hunter green. I paid it to avoid trouble, but looking back, it's ridiculous. The room's murmurs grew louder. Mrs. Patel spoke next, her voice thick with frustration. My son put up a basketball hoop in our front yard to play with friends. A week later, we got a $300 fine for an unapproved structure. I had to take it down, but I still paid. In the corner, the Thompsons couldn't stay quiet any longer. Mrs. Thompson, eyes red, recounted. Our daughter's disabled, and we built a wheelchair ramp for her to get in and out. Karen fined us $700 because it didn't fit the neighborhood's aesthetic. We couldn't afford to fight it, so we paid and repainted it to her liking. The whispers turned to outraged cries. Longtime residents, those who'd lived here before Karen's reign, began to realize they'd been bullied and forced to pay illegal fines for years. Miles raised a hand for quiet. These aren't just personal stories. We've got bigger proof. He set the documents on the table, pointing to the numbers in the financial reports Eleanor had uncovered. Eleanor found that tens of thousands of dollars from our fines have vanished into vague expenses. Legal consulting for Waylon Gutierrez, community maintenance with no receipts, and a reserve fund no one's ever heard of. The HOA, under Karen's watch, isn't just harassing us, they're defrauding and embezzling our money. The room erupted, as if a dam of pent-up frustration had finally burst. Mr. Jenkins slammed his hand on his chair, shouting, "I knew it. She always acted so high and mighty, but she's a thief." Mrs. Patel shook her head, whispering to her husband in Hindi, while the Thompsons hugged each other, a mix of anger and relief washing over them as the truth came to light. A middle-aged man near the door, Mr. Carl, who rarely joined community events, spoke up. "I once saw Waylon Gutierrez sign a contract with a construction company without a vote. I thought it was normal, but now I bet our money went straight into their pockets." Miles nodded. "We can't let this go on. I recorded my confrontation with Karen yesterday, and I've got video of the vandalism. But more importantly, we have these documents. I propose we take this to Sheriff Martinez tonight." The crowd roared in agreement. Miles pulled out his phone and dialed the sheriff. After a few rings, Martinez's warm, steady voice answered. "Miles, what's up this late?" "Sheriff," Miles said firmly, "I'm at Eleanor Ramos's with over 30 neighbors. We've got evidence that Karen Williams's HOA has abused its power, issued illegal fines, and embezzled tens of thousands from us. We need you to launch a legal investigation." He put the call on speaker for everyone to hear. Martinez paused, then replied, "I had my suspicions about Karen after that bulldozer stunt yesterday. If you've got documents and statements, this isn't just an internal issue. It could be criminal. Send me everything you have, and I'll start the investigation first thing tomorrow when I'm back at the station." Eleanor smiled, squeezing Miles's hand. "Thank you, Miles. You've given us hope." The crowd clapped, some hugging each other as a sense of unity spread through the room. Miles emailed Martinez right then and there, attaching photos of the financial reports, the camera footage, and the recording of his standoff with Karen. He knew this was just the beginning. The investigation might take time, and Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. But this time, she wasn't facing just him. She was up against a community that had woken up. As people started to leave, Mr. Jenkins clapped Miles on the shoulder. "You did good, Phillips. Need a witness? Call me." Mrs. Patel promised to bake him naan as thanks, while the Thompsons offered a grateful nod. Eleanor held Miles back last. "Karen will hit back," she warned. "She's got Waylon and that real estate company behind her. Don't get complacent." Miles nodded. "I know. But now we've got the whole neighborhood and the law on our side. She can't keep winning forever." That night, as Miles returned home and looked out at his ravaged garden, he no longer felt despair. Instead, he saw a glimmer of hope, not just for the new tomatoes he'd replant, but for all of Willow Creek Estates. A few days later, after reviewing the files and evidence Miles sent, Sheriff Martinez confirmed that Karen's HOA had not only overstepped its authority, but could face criminal charges, though it'd take time to solidify the case. Miles knew the fight wasn't over, but it wouldn't be long now before Karen had to answer for what she'd done. On Monday morning, more than a week after the meeting at Eleanor's, Miles got a call from Tom Carver, his old friend from the law firm. Tom's voice crackled through the phone, a mix of excitement and gravity. "Miles, I've gone over the camera footage you sent. I can't definitively ID Karen as the one who trashed your garden. She's too careful about hiding her face. But while digging into the HOA financials you included, I stumbled onto something way bigger." Miles gripped the phone tighter, his heart racing. "What is it, Tom?" Tom took a deep breath. "Karen Williams and Waylon Gutierrez have embezzled over $400,000 from the HOA's funds over the past 4 years. They funneled it into a private company under Waylon's name, Gutierrez Development LLC, under the guise of neighborhood improvement projects. but there's no evidence those projects ever happened. No invoices, no specific contracts, just massive transfers disguised in the financial reports. Miles sank into a chair, his mind reeling. $400,000, he muttered. They've been stealing from all of us. Tom pressed on. I cross-checked the transactions with public records. Whalen's company isn't even registered for construction work in your county. This is blatant fraud, Miles. You need to bring this out so everyone sees Karen's true colors. Miles thanked Tom before hanging up, knowing this evidence wasn't just enough to topple Karen and Whalen. It could land them behind bars. That evening, the Willow Creek Estates community gathered again, this time at the neighborhood meeting hall, a place Karen had once used to enforce her rules. The tension was palpable as Miles stood before the crowd, holding up the papers Tom had analyzed. Karen and Whalen haven't just been harassing us, he said, his voice echoing through the room. They've embezzled over $400,000 from our fines and maintenance fees, siphoning it into their own pockets under the cover of fake projects. The crowd erupted in furious shouts. Mr. Jenkins leapt to his feet, waving a fist. I told you. They're crooks. Mrs. Patel clutched her face, murmuring, Our money, it's all been a lie. Eleanor, seated in the front row, remained calm as she tapped her cane on the floor. We can't let them keep this up. I move to dissolve the current HOA leadership immediately and elect a new board. Thunderous applause broke out. The Thompsons, Mr. Carl, and dozens more voiced their support. With near-unanimous agreement, the community voted to end Karen and Whalen's reign, demanding Sheriff Martinez expand his investigation based on the new evidence. But Karen and Whalen didn't sit idly by. The next morning, as Miles stepped out to check his mail, he found a scrap of paper tucked under his door, scrawled in jagged handwriting. Think you've won, Phillips? This isn't over. Watch yourself. He recognized Karen's script instantly. Her arrogance hadn't dimmed, even as her power crumbled. Miles gave a faint smirk, pocketing the note, and calling Martinez right away. They're threatening me, he said, and I've got a feeling they're about to run. Martinez didn't waste a second. Armed with Tom's evidence and the neighbor's statements, he secured arrest warrants for Karen Williams and Whalen Gutierrez on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and property destruction. That afternoon, the sheriff led a team to Karen's house, but it was empty, garage door ajar, her car gone, only a few shredded papers littering the floor, signs of a frantic escape. Whalen was nowhere to be found at Gutierrez Development LLC either. They've hightailed it, Martinez told Miles over the phone. But don't worry, we'll track them down. 3 years passed. Willow Creek Estates slowly reclaimed its peace. Miles replanted his tomato garden, expanding it into the backyard with help from Mr. Jenkins and Mrs. Patel. A new HOA board was elected, transparent and fair, free of baseless fines or intimidation. Karen and Whalen faded from memory, their saga reduced to a cautionary tale, though they still hadn't been caught. The police figured they'd fled the state, likely living off the embezzled funds and hiding somewhere. Then, on a spring weekend in 2025, Miles visited his old friend Tom Carver in Chicago. After lunch, they decided to stroll through Tom's neighborhood for some fresh air. As they passed a small park, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. We need a strong HOA to preserve this neighborhood's value, it declared, brimming with arrogance and confidence. Miles turned, and his heart nearly stopped. It was Karen Williams. Her hair dyed a different color, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, but that stance and smug grin were unmistakable. She stood amid a group of residents, campaigning for a spot on the new HOA board under the alias Linda. Miles froze, staring unblinkingly. Tom noticed the shift in his expression and whispered, Is that her? Miles nodded, his mind racing with options. He could step forward, expose Karen's past to everyone right there. He could call the police on the spot, ending her 3-year run. Or he could stay quiet, watching to see if she'd repeat her old mistakes. Linda didn't seem to spot him in the crowd, continuing her speech with that syrupy, calculating tone. Miles turned to Tom, a glint of resolve in his eyes. What do you think, Tom? What should we do with her? Tom shrugged, grinning. Up to you, Miles. But if I were you, I'd call someone to gift her a nice pair of silver figure-8 bracelets. Miles said nothing, just pulled out his phone, fingers sliding across the screen. But who did he call, and what would he do next? No one knew for sure. Under Chicago's blazing red sunset, Karen's silhouette lingered, oblivious that her past might be on the verge of catching up once more. And you? Where are you hearing this story? And have you ever gone against HOA? Would you like more stories about someone going against HOA? If your answer is yes, please like and subscribe to the channel so that YouTube can notify you every time we post another story on the channel.